50,000 people used to live here. Now it's a ghost town.
When you think of Call of Duty these days, what do you picture? For me, that image of Call of Duty began with COD 4.
My name is Grant Collier, studio head of Infinity Ward. For Call of Duty 4, we have continued on our technology that we created for Call of Duty 2. The graphics are just coming alive in Call of Duty 4.
Bombastic, over-the-top, action movie-esque campaigns, combined with arcade-style multiplayers, built around the idea of progression and unlocking all the different guns, attachments, and camos. While obviously that has evolved over the years, some to the detriment of the franchise, the influences of Call of Duty 4 can still be seen today, even in the modern Call of Duties. COD 4 in 2007 changed not only the future of Call of Duty as a franchise, but the entire gaming world, effects that we still see to this day. Before COD 4, Call of Duty wasn't a nobody by any means. The prior 3 games had all carved out a niche for Call of Duty as a solid World War II shooter, mostly based around the campaigns with the additional solid multiplayer experiences for those that were interested.
People are going to feel that this game is up and in their face like no other game before.
But it was Call of Duty 4's innovations and massive changes to both the campaign and the multiplayer that would cause the franchise to go from just another competing World War II FPS to the action FPS for years to come. The legacy of COD 4 is what set up the success of the franchise for years to come, and we still see it cashing off that success today. For some perspective on how big Call of Duty 4 was for the franchise, if you compare these sales numbers from Call of Duty 4 to the previous 3 titles, by November of 2013, COD 4 had sold at least 15.7 million copies. Call of Duty 3 had only sold 7.2, COD 2 5.9, and the original Call of Duty just 4.5 million. Now all of those numbers are nothing to scoff at, but you can see how much Call of Duty 4 grew the franchise, and it would only continue to grow from here on out. Not only did the game sell well, Call of Duty 4 was also littered with game awards and critical acclaim. We're talking awards for everything. The best action game, the best graphics, the best shooter, the best Xbox 360 game, the best PlayStation 3 game, and a laundry list of other accolades. This and Halo 3 were the multiplayer shooters of 2007, but Call of Duty had one massive advantage, and that was it wasn't limited to Xbox. If you take a look back at the Xbox most played games at the time, Halo 3 did hold off Call of Duty 4 for the top spot on Xbox, but COD 4 had free reign to dominate the multiplayer space on PlayStation, and it even had a pretty decent player base on PC, even if it was a bit more niche. Call of Duty was here to make a name, and COD 4 was the game to do it. No longer was the game competing with other World War II shooters to try and be the best. It had now ascended and entered a league of its own, and would spawn countless Call of Duty clones over the following years. The biggest and most obvious change for Call of Duty 4 was the setting. Prior to this game, Call of Duty was just another World War II franchise, attempting to recreate some of the stories and battles of World War II, while competing with a variety of other shooters in the same space. You had games like Medal of Honor, and a variety of others. The codename for the Call of Duty franchise was originally just Medal of Honor Killer, signifying their goal at the time, to take down the Medal of Honor franchise, which looking back at history, it clearly did. Going from a World War II setting to a modern setting not only allowed a fresh change of environment, but also made the games more relatable and easier to get into for many players. While modern day shooters had certainly existed before Call of Duty 4, this game catapulted them into a whole new level of influence that we hadn't quite seen prior. Many look back at Call of Duty 4 for its influences on multiplayer games, and don't get me wrong, it most definitely influenced that front. But its campaign would also ripple across the industry. While Call of Duty 4 isn't the first Call of Duty campaign by any means to do it, the campaign in COD 4 leans very heavily into that action movie trope where you're basically streamlined down a specific path with tons of set pieces happening throughout the campaign. This gives you that feeling of awe that you might not get in some of its competitors that were slightly more open or less scripted. Like many of the Call of Duty campaigns, this one opens up with that classic training sequence where you learn the controls and complete a timed exercise, and from there you're off to take on the world, or something like that. The game will also suggest a difficulty for you to play here, and while obviously picking veteran's gonna give you the most challenge, I personally believe that Call of Duty 4 and a lot of the other Call of Duties play better on hardened or even regular, if you just want to blast through it and experience the set pieces like a movie. Veteran difficulty, in my opinion, has a couple main issues in Call of Duty 4 that one could possibly describe as a skill issue, but I would argue they're more of a design flaw. One is many areas of the campaign have infinitely spawning enemies, so you can't just take your time and methodically clear out an area, but rather need to move forward to hit certain trigger points to try and progress the level. While this does definitely give you that overwhelming feeling of helplessness that one would have in a war, it can also just be frustrating and annoying on the higher difficulties to be in situations where you have to try and push through gunfire just to stop enemies from spawning endlessly. The other main issue with higher difficulties is that the time to kill can be near instant at times. So this means that something as simple as not clearing out a corner or not knowing where an enemy is going to pop out can mean instant death. This leads to a scenario where on Veteran, the game becomes a sort of trial and error where you need to mostly memorize where certain enemies are to avoid being instantly killed. You'll end up getting set back to a checkpoint pretty often. Unrelated to the difficulty itself, you'll learn that mechanics like flinch are also tuned pretty high in Call of Duty 4, and getting shot can mean a death sentence if you're not able to quickly get behind cover or get the last bullet or two into an enemy, as the flinch will make it very hard to land shots on enemies that are shooting at you. As you play through the campaign, you're going to end up swapping between two different perspectives, one being the US Marines and the other being the British SAS, across a variety of different locales in the UK, Middle East, Azerbaijan, Russia, and Ukraine. COD 4 does something that was also pretty unique for Call of Duty at the time, and you see that pretty early in the game during the mission where you control President Yasser Al-Fulani on his ride to be executed by Al-Assad. During this ride you can't move around, but you are able to look around, which is very reminiscent of Half-Life's style of cutscene, which were always in first person and left the player in control. COD 4 continues this trend throughout the game, where all the cutscenes are in first person and leave the player in some form of control during the various cutscenes, whether that's being able to fully move around or just be able to look around. The game's campaign doesn't necessarily do anything crazily innovative, but the atmosphere that it provides really immerses you in the game as you experience a variety of different locales and styles of mission, and you even get to utilize guns and different weapons that are not usable in the multiplayer due to things like having multiple attachments on a gun. This style of campaign though isn't perfect, and it does have one big downside, and that is the lack of player choice or ways for the player to express their playstyle. For the most part throughout the entire campaign, you just fight your way through a linear level, shooting enemies as they pop up and attempting to not die. You basically just go through the streamlined Call of Duty 4 campaign and do exactly what the game wants you to do. As is tradition, COD 4 heavily utilizes various set pieces throughout the campaign, whether that's through semi-interactive cutscenes or various missions where you're the AC-130 gunner mowing down enemies at night, or just being a gunner in a chopper. Now, while a lot of the levels in the campaign can kind of blend together a little bit, Call of Duty 4 definitely has some very notable levels, with some of my favorites being Shock and Eye and the infamous All Gillied Up. In the former, after clearing the area of enemies, you start to extract due to a nuclear threat, only to have one of your allied helicopters end up getting shot down. You then have to try and rescue this downed pilot. However, as you extract, the nuke ends up detonating, catching you and the other allied helicopters in the blast, killing you and all the troops with you. You even get this harrowing scene as you kind of die at the crash site before it ends up cutting away.
Contamination centers are being established at this time and will be operational within 2 hours.
In the latter mission, All Gillied Up, you play through a flashback of one of Captain Price's earlier missions, where you're set to assassinate the main protagonist for the game, Imran Zakiev. The mission is set 15 years prior to the main events of Call of Duty 4. Here you have to sneak through the abandoned Pripyat outside of Chernobyl until you are in position to take the sniper shot. Here you get an interesting minigame style sniping set piece where you have to line up your snipe while accounting for wind.
Target's acquired. Target down. I think I saw his arm fly off. Nice work, Lieutenant. We got him.
After hitting the shot, which you later find out ended up only injuring him, you are instantly pursued and have to try and escape with Macmillan. Here, Macmillan ends up getting hit by a crashing helicopter, which, I mean, come on, he probably could have dodged.
Then you've got to learn the 5 Ds of dodgeball. Dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge.
And you have to carry him to the extraction point while also fighting off enemies. However, you can't shoot when you're carrying him, so every time you get into an engagement, you have to set him down to be able to fight. After this, you end up getting to the end of the level where there's this huge standoff at the iconic Ferris wheel where you have to hold off waves of enemies until the helicopter arrives to extract you. Eventually, this completes the level, and it's honestly one of Call of Duty's most iconic levels. The campaign ends up closing out in a crazy race to try and stop the nukes that have been launched from reaching the United States, and then attempting to escape the launch facility once you shut down these nukes, where you are chased by trucks of enemies that are trying to eliminate you. Eventually, you get cornered and stuck on a bridge, and you have to try and fight for your life until a fuel tanker ends up exploding behind you. You get knocked unconscious, but eventually come back and have the chance to shoot and kill Zakheev for good this time. After taking him out and a couple of the guards with him, the loyalists end up actually showing up to save you, and as you pass out, you hear the British newscaster telling the world about a series of nuclear tests that went down in Russia, showing that the public has no clue what just went down.
The Russian government released a statement today confirming a series of nuclear missile tests in central Russia. Although world leaders were quick to denounce the action, Russian officials maintained that the missile tests fell well within established UN protocols. No comment was received from the ultra-nationalist party, where rumors of a possible leadership struggle have just begun to surface.
After this, you end up just getting a little prologue where you can just speedrun rescuing a hostage from a plane. You can also go back through and play the campaign in arcade mode, which gives a number of lives along with a point and multiplier system. While it's not super special, this was the first time that Call of Duty had that third main mode along with the regular campaign and multiplayer to add some additional replayability in the game. This would get fleshed out more in later games with things like Spec Ops and Zombies. Overall, the Call of Duty 4 campaign is a cool experience. Nothing revolutionary or absolutely amazing, but as an experience like many other Call of Duty campaigns, it's definitely worth its time. The production value feels amazing, and while the AI or gameplay at times can be a bit underwhelming, the campaign does a good job of mixing up styles of play throughout the playtime of the game to not overstay their welcome.
Dude, don't ask. Honestly, I hardly ever play COD 4 TDM.
I know, like, you get bad lobbies all the time. I play with you all the time on MW2. Oh, get it, dude. What?
Oh my god!
Yo!
Oh my fucking god!
However, as you know, it's not the campaign that really gets all the props for Call of Duty 4. A lot of that falls on the multiplayer. And the multiplayer for this game was absolutely revolutionary. One of the main new features in Call of Duty 4 was the rank and prestige system that completely overhauled how progression worked in these games. Here you would level up from 1 to 55, unlocking various weapons and perks throughout the leveling system. Now this wasn't the end though, as once you reached level 55, the player had the option to decide if they wanted to prestige. Prestiging would reset you back to 1, however it would give you a special badge based on which prestige you were going into, all the way up to prestige 10, which is that classic symbol. This gave players additional progression, but also gave them a hard choice whether they wanted to lose all their unlocks to do it all over again. However, those prestige icons were a status symbol that a lot of people wanted. Call of Duty 4 also added in the loadout system, which while very simple in comparison to today's Call of Duty, was totally revolutionary for the time. Here each player would pick a primary weapon, a secondary weapon, 3 perks, and an attachment for each of their guns. While Call of Duty 4 wasn't the most balanced game in the world, there were definitely weapons and perks that were stronger than others. Things like stopping power and the M16 were pretty widely used. There were so many different choices and playstyles that you could build a loadout for, whether it was using that stopping power with an M16 to kind of mow people down mid-range, or you could go with something utilizing steady aim and the P90 and Juggernaut if you wanted a more run and gun playstyle. There were a lot of different things that you could do with the loadouts, and even though they were simple, there was a lot of choice to them. There was also just so many iconic weapons in Call of Duty 4. You had the AK, the M4, the M16, the MP5, the shotguns, the snipers. There were so many different weapons in this game that saw a lot of use. unlike today's Call of Duties, which featured the gunsmith system, which you almost have to have a degree in Call of Duty just to be able to create a viable class, in COD 4 it really wasn't that hard. Some of the perks or weapons were a little bit better than others, but you really could just use whatever you wanted. The guns also at that point only allowed one attachment, so it was really hard to mess up your gun like it is today, where using the gunsmith you can almost ruin a gun with the wrong attachments. COD 4 also implemented the kill streak system, which was totally new to Call of Duty at the time. While this has evolved a ton over the years, COD 4 had the UAV at 3 kills, the airstrike at 5 kills, and the chopper at 7 kills. These would totally change the flow of the game and allowed players who were on a kill streak or having a good game to get a little extra bonus while they were playing. These have become iconic in the franchise and would evolve into so much more in the following games. If it wasn't for these, we probably would have never seen the nukes that would later become so iconic to the franchise. Another big innovation in Call of Duty 4 for the time was the unlockable camos. Here you had a variety of different camos all the way up to Red Tiger, which you would unlock for all the different guns in the game by completing the headshot challenges. So here you could flex how much you used a certain gun, like an M16, by getting a bunch of headshots with it and unlocking the later camos. However, this wasn't the end. Call of Duty 4 also introduced the golden guns for the first time. Back then they were only for specific guns, and you would get them by completing all the challenges for their respective weapon class, except for the gold Desert Eagle, which you got by hitting rank 55. Here you had the gold AK-47, the gold Dragunov, the gold Mini Uzi, along with some of the other golden weapons that were basically just a huge status symbol showing that you grinded out all of these different camos on the different guns. While this grind was nothing compared to some of the mastery camos in the recent Call of Duties, this was the beginning of that lineage where you had players grinding to unlock these different camos and adding that extra layer on top of the regular XP progression. It's also important to note that in this game, when you prestiged, you'd also lose all of your camos, so it made that choice even a little bit harder. Call of Duty 4 also shipped with a ton of content. The game shipped with 16 maps, and while lately it seems like it's hard to find truly iconic maps in a modern Call of Duty, Call of Duty 4 was littered with them. I'm not going to go through every map obviously, but if you just think back at some of the maps in Call of Duty 4, there were so many completely iconic maps. Strike, Shipment, Vacant, Crash, Bog, Backlot, Wet Work, and this is just naming a handful of the maps. You also had the DLC that came out the following year, which added 4 more maps: Broadcast, Chinatown, Creek, and Kill House. Overall, there was a really good variety of styles of map in Call of Duty 4, and a lot of them weren't that 3-lane map that has become so unanimous in multiplayer gaming. These were maps with unique layouts that all just seem to work really well due to the designs of the level. Now, we do have to admit that maybe Call of Duty 4 wasn't the perfect competitive game, but for the public lobby style of play, these maps were absolutely fantastic. Another super interesting thing about the maps, and don't get me wrong, Call of Duty is not the only game to have done this at the time, but a really interesting thing is that I think it almost worked unintentionally. Now, I don't know that for sure, but what you'll notice is a lot of these single player levels are reused as multiplayer levels. In a lot of games, what that ends up leading to is either the single player or the multiplayer is kind of hurt by that, as much as you try, you can't really design a level for both of them simultaneously. COD 4 though somehow hit that balance perfectly, where if you play the campaign first and you go play the multiplayer, the levels make sense as multiplayer levels, but it's also really cool to get to experience them in a different way. The same goes likewise if you had played the multiplayer first and then go back and experience the campaign. You get to experience those multiplayer levels in a whole new way. There are slight changes here and there to make them work in the different environments, which I think is key, but it's really cool how I think they managed to make those levels and those assets work for both single player and multiplayer. Call of Duty 4 also had a good variety of game modes. You had the classics that you know today like Domination, Free-for-All, Headquarters, Team Deathmatch, and Search and Destroy, but you also had some of the cooler stuff like Ground War, which was just even more players smashed onto the same maps. You had Old School, which was this cool mode that got rid of loadouts and instead made you pick up weapons off the map. You had Hardcore, obviously, which we're familiar with today, and Team Tactical, which was 3v3 COD 4. There was a lot of cool game modes here, and combined with those really good maps, just made for a really good time. it's hard not to see the influence and legacy that Call of Duty 4 has left behind it. Not only did we get the sequels Modern Warfare 2 and Modern Warfare 3, we also got the Modern Warfares, which are sort of a reboot based around the franchise, and we got MWR. Along with this, we also saw some of the heads of Infinity Ward go over and create the Titanfall franchise. Call of Duty 4 also just set up Infinity Ward to be one of the most successful developers for many years to come. Without Call of Duty 4, you have to wonder what multiplayer may have looked like during this era of gaming. It could have ended up looking a lot more like Halo and a lot less like Call of Duty like it sort of did. To this day, Call of Duty 4 is one of my favorite games I've ever played, and it's most definitely one of my favorite Call of Duties. Nobody really forgets how Call of Duty 4 was for the time. It's just crazy to look back at Call of Duty 4, which released in 2007, and just see how complete of a release this was. And it wasn't just full of filler content either. A lot of this content, the maps, the game modes, the campaign, the multiplayer, was all there and was amazing. Obviously, the Call of Duty franchise still exists today and is still absolutely massive. But you do have to wonder where the franchise would have been if it wasn't for Call of Duty 4 setting that groundwork so many years ago. COD 4 basically came out and took the gaming world by storm, and since then the Call of Duty franchise, even through its ups and downs, really has never let go of that hold. Anyways, that's gonna do it for the video. Check out some of my other videos. Recently we did a video on Modern Halo that's pretty interesting. If you want to support the channel, you can also check out my Patreon, and I'll see you all next time.